The Baltimore Ravens are heading into the 2026 season as one of the favorites to win it all. Expectations are sky high, and plenty of people believe this team has what it takes to make a serious Super Bowl run. But there's one concern that's starting to gain traction, and it revolves around Derrick Henry, one of the most important players on the entire roster. Because as incredible as he's been, Henry is now entering a stage of his career where very few running backs manage to maintain the same level of dominance. And that's where things get really interesting. Can Derrick Henry beat Father Time one more time? Or are the Ravens putting too much faith in a player who's already absorbed years of wear and tear? When you look at the numbers, the history of the NFL, and the massive responsibility Baltimore has placed on his shoulders, you realize this conversation is a lot more serious than it may seem at first glance. And some of the details we're about to break down could completely change the way you view the Ravens' chances this season. When I look at Derrick Henry, honestly, it's hard for me to see him as just another player. We're talking about a guy who has spent years making one of the toughest positions in football look easy. How many times have we watched defenders try to bring him down, only to end up getting dragged for extra yards? That's why whenever people bring up Henry's age as a concern for the Ravens, a lot of fans immediately respond with, "Hold on, he still looks dominant." And honestly, I get it. But there's one detail that simply can't be ignored. Henry enters the 2026 season at 32 years old, an age that has historically been a major turning point for NFL running backs. And it's not because players suddenly lose their talent overnight. The real issue is accumulated wear and tear. Running back is one of the most physically demanding positions in sports. Every carry means crashing into defenders who are doing everything they can to stop you. Year after year, those hits add up. In my opinion, that's what makes the situation so fascinating. The concern isn't whether Derrick Henry is still talented. The concern is whether his body can continue doing what his mind still knows how to do. What's even more impressive is that Henry keeps defying what history tells us should happen. If someone only watched his highlights from the last couple of seasons, they probably wouldn't even realize he's already in his 30s. But the NFL has never been kind to aging running backs. Over the years, we've seen countless stars look unstoppable until suddenly their production started to decline. Am I saying that's about to happen to Henry? Not at all. In fact, if there's anyone capable of beating the odds, it's probably him. But if I were a Ravens fan, I'd still be asking myself one question. Can he really keep this up for another season? And that question becomes even more important when you realize just how much Baltimore is counting on him. The Ravens aren't simply hoping for a solid season from Derrick Henry. They're expecting him to remain one of the focal points of an offense with legitimate Super Bowl aspirations. And that's where this conversation takes another turn. Because there's a very specific reason experts are worried about his durability. The incredible workload he's carried throughout his career. Once you start looking at those numbers, it's easy to understand why so many people believe Henry's biggest challenge in 2026 won't be opposing defenses. It'll be overcoming the years of punishment his body has already endured. If there's one thing that makes the Derrick Henry age debate so complicated, it's the fact that the numbers refuse to cooperate with the critics. Normally, when a player reaches 32 years old, signs of decline begin showing up in the stat sheet. But when I look at what Henry has done over the last 2 seasons in Baltimore, I see the exact opposite. We're talking about 3,516 rushing yards and 32 rushing touchdowns in just 2 years. Those are numbers that many younger running backs would love to put up during the absolute prime of their careers. And that's exactly what makes Henry such a unique case. While most running backs are simply trying to stay relevant after turning 30, he's still producing like one of the NFL's most dangerous offensive weapons. We're not talking about a veteran hanging on for one last ride. We're talking about a player who still forces defensive coordinators to completely change their game plans. In my opinion, that's the biggest reason so many people continue to believe he can beat the odds. When you watch him play, you don't see someone compensating for age with experience. You see an athlete who still physically imposes his will on opponents. That said, there's another side to the story. Statistics don't always tell the whole truth. Yes, Henry remains incredibly productive. Yes, he's still one of the most feared running backs in football. But the higher the level of performance, the harder it becomes to sustain it. It's like a sports car running at top speed year after year. Eventually, The question stops being how fast it is and becomes how much longer it can keep going before something gives out. And that's exactly the question that's starting to hover over Baltimore. That's why I think the Ravens find themselves in a very unusual situation. Henry's numbers inspire confidence, but at the same time, they increase the pressure on him. After all, when you've been this dominant, even a small drop in production becomes noticeable. And there's another factor that makes the situation even more complicated: the sheer number of carries he's accumulated throughout his career. Once you look at his workload history, you realize the challenge isn't simply continuing to produce. It's continuing to produce after carrying a workload that very few running backs in NFL history have ever been able to survive. And that's where the concern starts becoming much more real. This is where the conversation starts getting really interesting. Because when we only look at Derrick Henry himself, it feels easy to believe that he can continue dominating for several more years. But when we take a step back and look at NFL history, we find a very different reality. The truth is that running backs rarely maintain extraordinary production after turning 32 years old. This isn't just an opinion or a prediction. It's something the numbers have shown for decades. The article highlights a truly incredible statistic. Throughout NFL history, there have only been 4 seasons where a running back aged 32 or older recorded more than 1,200 rushing yards. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about thousands of players who have played in the league over the years, and only a very small group has been able to accomplish something like that. Among those names are legends like Walter Payton and John Riggins, players who helped define the running back position and became some of the greatest names in football history. And that's exactly why the expectations surrounding Derrick Henry are so massive. The Ravens aren't just asking him to have a good season. They're asking him to accomplish something that almost nobody before him has been able to do. When we talk about numbers this rare, we're no longer comparing Henry to today's running backs. We're comparing him to some of the greatest players the position has ever seen. And that shows just how big the challenge ahead of him will be in 2026. At the same time, maybe that's exactly what makes this story so exciting to follow. Because if there's one player who could break into a list reserved for legends, Derrick Henry is probably one of the few names you would believe could do it. But to get there, he'll have to overcome more than just the defenders standing in front of him. He'll have to overcome years of physical punishment and an enormous workload that very few players have ever experienced. And once we start looking at just how many carries Henry has taken throughout his career, it becomes clear why so many experts believe this could be the biggest test he's ever faced. If I had to point to one reason that explains all the concerns surrounding Derrick Henry, this would probably be it. It's not just his age. It's not a lack of talent. And it's not because his production has suddenly fallen off. The biggest concern is the unbelievable amount of work he has already taken on throughout his career. And when you look at those numbers, you immediately understand why so many analysts are starting to ask questions. Henry has surpassed 260 carries in a season 6 different times. Even more impressive, in 5 of those seasons, he went over 300 rushing attempts. For people who don't follow the NFL closely, that might just look like another statistic. But in reality, every single one of those carries represents a physical collision against some of the strongest and fastest athletes in the world. That's hundreds of hits every single season. Multiply that over several years, and you start to understand the amount of stress a running back's body has to absorb. What's interesting is that many players who managed to extend their careers often had lighter workloads at certain points. Derrick Henry has had a completely different path. Throughout his career, he has been treated as the centerpiece of every offense he's been part of. When a team needed tough yards, when they needed someone to close out a game, when they needed a play that changed momentum, the ball usually ended up in Henry's hands. That workload helped create his legendary reputation, but also created a physical bill that eventually has to be paid. And maybe that's the biggest challenge facing the Ravens in 2026. We're not talking about a player trying to prove he still belongs in the NFL. Derrick Henry has already proven that countless times. The real question is whether he can continue handling the same level of physical demand that he has carried for almost his entire career. Because if the wear and tear finally starts catching up with him, Baltimore won't just lose a productive running back. They'll lose one of the players who defines the identity of their offense. And that leads us to the biggest question surrounding this entire situation. Just how much responsibility are the Ravens placing on the shoulders of a player who has been defying expectation for years?
If you're enjoying this breakdown, smash that like button to help the purple flock grow.
When you look at the entire situation surrounding Derrick Henry, his age, his workload, and the history of veteran running backs, everything leads to one clear conclusion. The Ravens need him, maybe even more than many fans realize. When you analyze Baltimore's roster, it's obvious that the organization sees Henry as one of the central pieces of its Super Bowl ambitions. He's not a secondary option. He's not just another weapon in the offense. He remains one of the most important parts of the entire plan, and that creates a tremendous amount of pressure. There's a big difference between asking a veteran player to provide some production and depending on him to perform at an elite level for an entire season. In my opinion, that's where the risk comes in. The Ravens aren't betting on a smaller version of Derrick Henry. They're betting that he can still be the same dominant force who has punished offenses for years. And that's an enormous expectation for any player, especially someone who is already past the age where most running backs begin to decline. On top of that, the situation around him may not be completely perfect. Baltimore still has questions in certain areas of the offensive line and will also have to adjust to important changes within the organization. That means Henry could face more difficult situations than he did in previous seasons. And when one player becomes so important to a team's success, even a small drop in performance can have a much bigger impact on the entire offense. That's why I believe Derrick Henry's 2026 season could become one of the most fascinating chapters of his career. This isn't just about rushing yards or touchdowns. This is about proving once again that he can challenge what NFL history usually tells us about players at his position and his age. The Ravens believe he can do it. The fans believe he can do it. And maybe Derrick Henry himself believes it more than anyone. But the reality is that in the NFL, belief alone isn't enough. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes Henry's journey one of the most intriguing stories to watch this season. Derrick Henry has spent years proving that he can do things most running backs simply can't. Even at 32 years old, he enters the season as one of the NFL's most dangerous offensive weapons and a crucial part of the Baltimore Ravens' plans. But for the first time in a long time, the conversation isn't just about what he has already accomplished. The real question is whether he can continue producing at an elite level while facing the one challenge no athlete can avoid: time. What makes this story so fascinating is that there are strong arguments on both sides. On one hand, you have a player who continues putting up elite numbers and has already beaten expectations throughout his career. On the other hand, NFL history shows that very few running backs have been able to maintain this level of production after turning 32, especially after carrying the kind of workload Henry has handled. And for the Ravens, this isn't just another storyline. A major part of their 2026 Super Bowl hopes depends on whether their star running back can continue being the difference maker he has always been. Now I want to hear from you, Ravens fans. Do you believe Derrick Henry still has enough left to deliver another dominant season and help Baltimore make a Super Bowl run? Or do you think age and the wear and tear will finally start catching up with him in 2026? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.
And if you're a true Ravens fan and love keeping up with everything happening around the team, don't leave this video without sharing it with a friend who's just as passionate. They're definitely going to enjoy this. See those videos on your screen right now? I picked the first one especially for you, and the other is recommended by YouTube. Go check them out, and I'll see you in the next video.